Good afternoon. I think we're ready to begin. Good afternoon and welcome, everyone. I'm Carol Klee, Assistant Vice President for International Scholarship in the Office of International Programs at the University of Minnesota. Together with our co-organizers, Books for Africa, I would like to welcome you to the Conference on Literacy and Education in 21st Century Africa. The Office of International Programs is very pleased to partner in this collaborative effort as part of our Global Spotlight Initiative, which in 2009 and 2010 focuses on the continent of Africa and the issue of water in the world. We're absolutely delighted to partner with Books for Africa, a nonprofit organization headquartered in the Twin Cities, which is the world's largest shipper of donated books to the African continent. And I'd like to introduce our co-organizer, Pat Plonsky, the Executive Director of Books for Africa.
Thank you, Carol, and thank you, everyone, for being here today at this exciting conference. Books for Africa is honored to partner with the University of Minnesota, and in particular the Hubert H. Humphrey Institute of the University of Minnesota, in putting on this exciting conference. I am, as was noted, Patrick Plonsky. I'm the Executive Director, and I would like to thank some of the sponsors who helped make this event possible. And maybe I'll just ask the representatives to stand and then hold your applause until the last name is read of the organization. So Thomson Reuters was a key sponsor of this conference. Borton Overseas, I know Shell Berg is here. Please stand. And please just hold your applause. There are other sponsors, thankfully, and we appreciate that. South African Airways is a sponsor, and I know there's a representative here from South Africa Airways. General Mills is a sponsor. Land O'Lakes is a sponsor. Missionary Expeditors, the Books for Africa's #1 shipper of books overseas, is a sponsor. Robbins, Kaplan, Miller, and Cerisi. We appreciate their sponsorship. Bremer Bank, the International Book Bank, and as representatives, can please just stand. And then the Minnesota International Center, and I believe Carol Byrne is here. And the Minnesota Trade Office, I don't know if Paul Hansen is here. Thank you to all of our sponsors for putting this exciting conference together. I would also like to just introduce as a group and thank our planning committee that put this event together, and I'm just going to read their names, and please stand. Ron Amanzadi, Sherry Gray, Paul Hansen, Chris Johnstone, Angaluka Maki, I'm sure I'm mispronouncing that, I apologize, Sarah Schwiebert, Francis Vavros, John Vryans, Josh Wadanitsky, and Serena Wright. Thank you. As I said earlier, only slightly in jest, this conference was something Books for Africa sort of came up with the idea, but the University of Minnesota and their staff did most of the work, with the exception of Sarah Schwiebert in our Books for Africa office, who did a lot of the important work here with Books for Africa. So thank you, everyone, the planning committee. I would like to introduce at this time two of our distinguished guests who are here with us today, and I will ask them to stand. We have with us Ambassador Dr. Augustine Mahiga from the United Republic of Tanzania. Ambassador Mahiga is Tanzania's permanent representative to the United Nations, and we're honored to have him with us today. And this is a name I've been mispronouncing all day, so I'll just continue mispronouncing. Jillian Mothama. She is, and I'll ask, where's Jillian? Over here? Yes? Jillian is the Vice Consul for the South African Consulate General Office in Chicago, and we are sending a container of books to South Africa tomorrow, and so we're glad that Jillian can be a part of that. So thank you, everyone, for being here today. It's my honor to introduce Dean Brian Atwood, the Dean of the Hubert H. Humphrey Institute of Public Affairs. And I will ask Dean Atwood to step to the podium now.
Well, thank you very much, Pat. And I can just say on behalf of the Humphrey Institute and the University of Minnesota that we're delighted to host this meeting today and to celebrate relationships with Africa, a place I was first assigned to Africa in the Foreign Service for 2 years in the late 1960s, and as aid administrator traveled all over Africa. And I know that what we're going to hear from Ambassador Carson today is a message not only of the troubles that face Africa, but the hopes that African people have. We have in this very room honored African presidents, President Wade, and I'm told that the last time Ambassador Carson was here, the university gave an honorary degree to President Museveni of Uganda, where Johnnie was ambassador at that time. We've also just this last year honored Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, the President of the Republic of Liberia. So this is a place that we believe should be seen by Africans as a friendly place and a place where we reach out to them. And Books of Africa does that so effectively. I just want to say I congratulate people like Tom Worth, who was a dreamer. When he came to this country, he said, "Here I am in the upper Midwest, how can we reach out to Africa?" And you've done it. Pat, you've carried this on. It's been a tremendous contribution to Africa. And I thank everyone who's engaged with Books for Africa for doing that. Now I'm really honored to introduce a congressman who has made a tremendous impact in Africa and in the Middle East. Our congressman here from Minneapolis, a person who was the first Muslim to be elected to Congress. He's probably tired of hearing that by now. I'm sure he won't be the last one. But he's someone who represents us extraordinarily well. He now serves on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, so he's a real interest in this event today. Congressman Keith Ellison.
Thank you, Dean Atwood, and thank you to the entire administration in the University of Minnesota. We're extremely proud of the University of Minnesota. And Mr. Ambassador, Ambassador Carson, we'd like you to know that we all extend you the warmest welcome that we can possibly extend to you. We're very excited about your visit. And we want you to know a few things about us here. One is that we are very proud of our university. Our university is one that is global in perspective, not only from an academic standpoint, but from the standpoint of person-to-person contact. It's not rare at all to find members of this university community looking for ways to reach out, to share ideas, and to extend olive branch of friendship across the globe. And we're very proud of that. And it's not only the University of Minnesota, although it is the University of Minnesota, it's other universities as well. We can go across the street to Augsburg, and they're busy doing the same thing, and we're proud of our entire academic community. We're also proud of our corporate community. The fact is that we have a corporate community that has a very strong sense of social responsibility. Many of them have made this event possible today, but it's the kind of thing we've come to be used to from our community here, and we're grateful for all of them for sponsoring this event and for helping to participate with Books of Africa. But the most important thing that I'd like to share with you is that we have a vibrant, energetic, dynamic community that has a very strong sense of itself as citizens in a increasingly globalizing world. And what this means is individual citizens, but also NGOs, also non-governmental organizations like Books for Africa, like the Center for Victims of Torture, like the American Refugee Committee, like the International Institute, and various other organizations that are reaching out all the time. People might be surprised because we don't exist on a coast, but we still are global in scope. And we have people, we have a very strong community here made up of people who may trace their roots back on American soil for 14, 15 generations, and others who may have just arrived here last week, all of whom are Americans and residents of this great country who have a sense of the rest of the world. And let me just say, as I wrap up my very short remarks, I hope they're short, that I think that we view our relationship with the rest of the world, including Africa, is not one of a donor-donee relationship, not one of a first world, third world relationship, but really as members of a global community reaching out in partnership so that we can do what we can to share what we have, but also gain back what the rest of the world has, including that of Africa. We view ourselves as involved in partnership, mutual sharing, mutual interest, mutual respect, words that the president has evoked, but which I think many people in the audience today have been feeling in their heart for quite a long time. And so with that, I think it's time for me to hand the mic over to the Dean, but thank you very much for allowing me to share a few reflections, Dean. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Congressman. And now it's my great privilege to introduce the Senior Vice President and Provost of the University. That's the number 2 person at the university. In many ways, he is number 1. He's a scholar. He's someone who's taken a tremendous interest in global affairs. He's just this past year written a book on just war and proportionality and the legal implications and the origins of the just war theory. And I had him in my global policy course. He was kind enough to come and share his knowledge with our students. He's a tremendous friend of mine and of the Humphrey Institute. And he's going to introduce our special guest today because he's a friend of his as well. Sorry, Tom Sullivan.
Thank you very much, Brian, for that warm introduction, and welcome to all of you to the University of Minnesota. It's my great pleasure this afternoon to welcome you on behalf of President Bob Bruniks, and particularly for this very exciting conversation about Africa. Throughout the day, as I think you'll see in just a few minutes, throughout the day we have one of America's most distinguished diplomats with us to discuss important issues about and around Africa. It is wonderful to have Ambassador Johnnie Carson, the Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of African Affairs, with us throughout the day. Johnnie and I have been friends for a number of years. We share an alma mater together, and on that relationship, we have served on its Board of Trustees. And as I was kidding him earlier today, were we not here sharing today with you, we would be at that Board of Trustees meeting. After Ambassador Carson graduated from Drake University with a bachelor's degree in political science and history in 1965. He served in the Peace Corps in Tanzania for 3 years, living and working and teaching in many of the villages there. Afterwards, he went to London, where he received his Master's of Arts degree in International Relations from the University of London School of Oriental and Asian Studies in 1975. He has had a very distinguished career in almost 40 years in the Foreign Service of the United States. His entire professional working career has been in and on Africa, where he has traveled throughout the continent for those 40 years. He has been an ambassador in 3 of those countries, Uganda, Zimbabwe, and Kenya. From 1997 to 1999, he was the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary for the Bureau of African Affairs in the Department of State for the United States. From 2003 to 2006, he was the Senior Vice President for the National Defense University in Washington, D.C. I kid him, that's something like the job I have now, Johnnie. And in September 2006, he joined the National Intelligence Council as the intelligence officer for all of Africa. On May 7th of this year, Ambassador Carson was sworn in as the Assistant Secretary for African Affairs for the United States Department of State. Ambassador Carson is the recipient of numerous awards and honors from the State Department. Most particularly, he received the Meritorious Service Award from Secretary of State Madeleine Albright. And very importantly, I think also, he received from the Center of Disease Control its most prestigious award, the Champion of Prevention, for his direct leadership in the United States government's activity and leadership in HIV/AIDS prevention efforts in Kenya. Ambassador Carson has said, quote, "My years of service across the African continent have given me a deep respect for Africa's people, their rich history, culture, and the challenges they face today in a world of rapid globalization, technological advances, and climate change." As he leads the United States African effort, he has identified 5 areas of critical importance for Africa that reflect on America's core values and interests. First, the strengthening of democratic institutions. Second, promoting sustained economic development for Africa. Third, continuing to emphasize public health and the strengthening of Africa's delivery system for public health. Fourth, resolving cross-border and interstate conflicts and disputes. And fifth and finally, confronting new transnational challenges to Africa, including narco-trafficking, climate control, illegal exploitation of Africa's marine resources, and pandemic diseases and energy security. And importantly, Ambassador Carson has said, quote, "We believe that the 21st century will be shaped not merely in the capitals of the super and the superpowers, but also by the continent of Africa and its many outstanding leaders as well." Please join me in a warm Minnesota welcome for one of America's most distinguished diplomats, the Honorable Johnnie Carson.
Thank you. Thank you very, very, very much. I'll start off by saying if I can get that kind of a welcome every day in Washington, I would be grateful. I think maybe I should move to Minnesota. Let me first of all thank the provost of the university, Tom Sullivan, for a very, very gracious introduction, and it's especially kind coming from him. I also want to underscore the long friendship that we've had, and the incentive to come out here was largely driven by that friendship. I also want to recognize the dean of the Hubert Humphrey Institute, Brian Atwood, who has also been a friend and a colleague as well in Washington, D.C. And I can say that all of you who have an opportunity to work and study here and interact with Dean Atwood have a real pro to learn from as well. Congressman Ellison, pleasure to be with you this afternoon. I certainly see and respect the good work that you do in Washington, especially related to foreign affairs. We've got Ambassador Mahiga, who I saw just last week in New York, where we were both at the UN General Assembly, and it's good to see him out here as well. The sponsors of this event, particularly Books for Africa, the Pat, and certainly Tom Worth, who I suspect is here in the audience someplace. Thank you for your sponsorship and your good work. I had the pleasure of meeting Tom Worth a number of years ago, and it's good to be here to see him again. I'm extremely pleased to be able to join you today to discuss literacy and education in Africa in the 21st century. And I'm especially pleased to be back in Minneapolis after so many years.
I was here 16 years ago when the University of Minnesota conferred an honorary doctorate degree on President Yoweri Museveni of Uganda. At the time, I was the United States ambassador to Uganda, and President Museveni was regarded as one of Africa's new generation of young leaders. He was invited here out of recognition of the work that he had done in leading his country out of many years of hostility and violence. In the 15 years plus since I was here last, a great deal has changed in Africa. We have seen significant progress across Africa in a number of areas, including democratization, economic policy reform, and the reduction of state violence. The greatest progress has been made in the area of democracy and governance. All across the African continent, Africans support democracy and the values that underpin it. The two most recent and major examples of this are to be found in Ghana and also in South Africa. In January of this year, Ghanaians went to the polls and selected John Atta Mills as their new president, marking the fourth successful presidential election in that country in the past 15 years, and the second time the ruling party had been defeated at the polls and replaced by the opposition. And in April of this year, over 13 million South Africans, blacks, whites, coloreds, and Indians, went peacefully to the polls to elect a new president, Jacob Zuma. Mr. Zuma is South Africa's fourth president since the end of the apartheid era. These recent elections in Ghana and South Africa, as well as others that have taken place this year and in recent years, are not unique and represent an aspect of Africa's unfolding democratic history that is often overlooked by commentators and the media. Since 1998, and that is an important date because it marks, in fact, the fall of communism, dozens of African countries have embraced democratic rule. In 1973, when a New York-based organization called Freedom House began to publish an annual survey on democracy around the world, that first survey that came out listed only 3 African countries as being free and democratic. The most recent surveys show that there are 12 democracies in Africa, and probably as many as 25 that are considered near democracies. All across the continent, we have seen countries embrace constitutional rule, routine and regular elections, and move into the democratic camp. This is remarkable. This is a remarkable achievement, given that 30 years ago, military dictatorships and one-party states predominated across the continent. Africa has also made measurable strides in the economic field. African governments have liberalized their economies, embraced free market reforms, and adopted pro-business policies. And prior to the onset of the global financial crisis in late 2007 and early 2008, Africa had experienced nearly a decade of positive, sustained growth, with the average per capita growth being somewhere close to 5.5% a year. Although much of this growth was driven by oil and gas exports and the rise in mineral and commodity prices, significant policy changes by African governments, an upsurge in African agricultural exports, and the expansion of Africa's entrepreneurial middle class have played a major role in the economic turnaround. There has also been a sharp reduction in the number of conflicts around Africa over the past decade and a half. The bloody and often barbaric civil wars that ripped apart Liberia and Sierra Leone throughout much of the 90s have ended, and both of those countries have returned to peace under democratic governments. Dean Atwood mentioned earlier today that he had conferred an honorary degree on the president of Liberia, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. She has done a remarkable job of leading her country back to stability, peace, and also, most importantly, democracy. The hot war that erupted along the Ethiopian-Eritrea border has also gone dormant, and the massive outside intervention that threatened to cripple and divide the Congo has also started to fade. African leaders across the continent recognize the negative impact that violence and violent conflicts have on the region, on their economies, on their peoples, and on their national images. And they have begun to demonstrate a greater and stronger willingness to assume responsibility for preventing and responding to conflicts. One of the most significant indicators of this is the participation of African peacekeepers in two of Africa's ongoing conflicts: the AMISOM forces in Somalia, where we have Ugandans and Burundians trying to help provide stability to the transitional federal government, and also the large contingent of African peacekeepers, a part of the UN peacekeeping force in Sudan, led largely by Nigerian and Rwandan troops. But Africa's willingness to engage in and support peacekeeping operations reflects the recognition by Africa's leaders that they must stand up for democratic values, for human rights, political stability, and an end to violence in those parts of the continent that still face those kinds of challenges. Although Africa continues to face strategic challenges in replacing authoritarian governments, boosting long-term economic development, and ending several conflicts that continue, it also faces the challenges of dealing with illiteracy and poor education, which is in fact the subject of this conference. Illiteracy and poor education inhibit the ability of societies and governments to deal with the larger issues that I just spoke about. Africa's education and literacy challenges are compounded by the continent's rapid population growth. As many of you probably know, Sub-Saharan Africa's population of roughly 750 million people is expected to double in the next 25 years, producing millions of additional school-age children who will require education. President Obama and Secretary of State Hillary Clinton, who I might add is keenly interested in women's rights issues, both understand the linkage that exists between education and development, and also the ability of education to transform society, contribute to economic growth, and also to promote positive social, economic, and political change on the continent. President Obama and Secretary Clinton also know that education contributes greatly to political stability, and they know that education builds capacity to better understand and address the complex social and economic problems that have stalled Africa's development and contributed to some of its ongoing problems. They know, as we do, that education and literacy drive innovation and technology, and that innovation and technology are critical to solving Africa's old problems and its new problems in areas such as agriculture, healthcare, urban development as well. The United States government is committed through the State Department, the United States Agency for International Development, USAID, as well as the Peace Corps, to partner with Africa in the fight against illiteracy and the struggle to expand education and knowledge for all. Support for education is a part of our American heritage. Americans have a profound respect for education, and most of our leaders view education, public and private, as one of the foundation stones on which our great country has been built. Most Americans also believe that education is a universal right, one that enhances our freedoms, and one that should be available to everyone. We know that literacy and education can be liberating and personally rewarding. We also know that universal literacy and education strengthens our society, enriches our culture, helps us to solve problems, and improves our ability to cope with political and social adversity. Given our own national convictions, we think the positive benefits of education should be enjoyed by all of Africa's citizens. Although African literacy rates and educational attainment levels lag far behind those of the United States, Africans share our deep respect for education, and it is one of the many values that we share and hold in common. All across Africa, parents are calling for free universal primary education, and in many countries, African parents go to extraordinary lengths to send their children to school. Villages and communities pool their money to send a child to high school or to university in a region or a capital overseas. From my own experiences, both as a Peace Corps volunteer and having served in a number of African countries, I can recall individual African students who were being sent abroad, not just with the blessing and goodwill of their parents, but with the blessings and goodwill and financial assistance of the entire family and in sometimes the entire village. Africans know that education and literacy can generate a significant return. And I think it is no coincidence that African immigrants to the United States and their children comprise one of the most highly educated and financially successful demographic groups in the United States. And that's a fact that comes from our Bureau of Statistics. Indeed, immigrants from Africa do, in fact, make up a substantial professional class of people in the United States. Africans, like Americans, see the value of education and seize those opportunities whenever and wherever they are available. While the pursuit of universal literacy and widespread access to education may be a shared goal, we recognize that it places enormous stress on an already overburdened educational system in Africa. Africa is experiencing a major youth bulge, and primary school enrollment in African countries is among the lowest in the world. Finding the classroom space and buildings that are required will be hard, and recruiting and training and paying salaries of teachers will remain a challenge for many of Africa's cash-strapped governments. Over the past several decades, the United States government has sought to strengthen African educational systems and has emphasized country-led institutional reforms and capacity building. We have responded to country-specific needs by setting up programs to support the policy and curriculum reform of governments, and also to support the development of professional teachers and administrators, and to help them develop learning materials for use in the classroom. We've also helped to devise programs to expand literacy education and access to underrepresented populations across the continent. One of those underrepresented populations is young school-age girls. There is a large gender gap in educational access. For girls across Africa, largely because of local social customs, early marriage, and limited economic circumstances, are not given the same kinds of educational opportunities as young men or their brothers. Girls account for 2/3 of the nearly 40 million young school-age children in Africa who do not attend primary school. Closing the gender gap in education is essential for Africa's development and well-being. Improving education for women, particularly in rural areas and in Muslim communities in Africa, is one of the most effective ways that we can provide and can improve the health of families across Africa. Educated mothers can provide better protection for their children against malnutrition and the spread of disease. Moreover, when allowed to have access to education and literacy, women have often played extraordinary roles in promoting economic growth, democratic consolidation, and peace building in Africa. As I said, closing the gender gap in education and literacy is essential for Africa's long-term development and future well-being. It is impossible to develop when you leave half of the population out. When we often speak of Africa's potential in the context of its rich resources, but Africa's greatest resource is, of course, not diamonds or cobalt or oil or timber. It's its people. For the continent to achieve the full potential of its wealth and natural resources, we have to work together to ensure that women are allowed in the classroom in equal numbers to men. To narrow the gender disparity and support educational development more broadly in Africa, the United States government, through the Agency for International Development, works closely with African ministries of education, with universities and local NGOs and the private sector to fund educational programs for girls at primary and secondary level. A special girls' education initiative started during the Clinton administration remains a primary source of money for girls' scholarships in a number of African countries. The President's Africa Education Initiative, a $600 million multi-year program, focuses on increasing access to quality education in some 30 sub-Saharan countries by providing scholarships, textbooks, and teacher training programs. By 2010, some 80 million African children will have benefited from programs funded by this African Education Initiative. Improving teacher quality has also been a U.S. priority. The United States government is also working to develop, promote, and expand innovative methods for training teachers and educational administrators. Our programs provide support to help teachers upgrade their skills through pre-service and in-service training programs, to increase parent and community involvement in children's education, and to emphasize the importance of educating girls. We are also harnessing information technology and interactive radio instruction to reach marginalized and hard-to-reach populations. Education and literacy programs also play a particularly important role in transitioning populations from post-conflict environments to more stable social and economic conditions. In Liberia, where the adult literacy rate is estimated to be between 60 and 75%, and where decades of civil war and poor governance have devastated the public education system and created a tremendous need for informal and accelerated learning opportunities for youth and former soldiers, we are providing technical assistance to the Liberian Ministry of Education to support an accelerated learning program that condenses the usual 6 years of primary education into 3. This accelerated program will accommodate the needs of some 67,000 youth who were denied the opportunity to participate in formal schooling by poverty and a decade-long civil war. Without this education and literacy program, many of those young men would have limited economic prospects and might return to violence and crime to survive. Reflecting the needs of older students in a post-conflict environment, the Liberia program integrates life skills with courses in parenting, conflict resolution, and civic education. U.S. funding also supports the Liberian Teacher Training Program, which upgrades institutional and staff capacity at the University of Liberia and at several of the country's training colleges. The Ambassador's Girls Scholarship Program facilitates the education of children who would otherwise forego schooling. I have not exhausted by any means the programs funded by the United States government to promote education. Fulbright Scholars, Humphrey Fellows, who are here at this institute, and Eisenhower Fellows are just a few of the government-funded programs in education that we all know so well. And the private sector and the many U.S. government foundations like Ford and Rockefeller and Carnegie also contribute to this effort. And I certainly would add the good work of Books for Africa for the work that they do in helping to fight illiteracy and to promote education. All of these collaborative initiatives from the government and from the private sector help partner with Africa to deal with one of its most important issues, providing education and literacy to all. There are many things that we can do, but to expand education and literacy further in the 21st century to meet the challenges that will confront an Africa that is rapidly growing in population and in need of competitiveness in a global environment. Africa will have to concentrate, I believe, on 5 things. It will have to close the digital divide. More and more information is delivered telephonically and through computers. Business and education are done and delivered online. Although cell phones have begun to transform the lives of many Africans, Africa regrettably remains the least wired and digitally connected continent in the world. Just 3 weeks ago, 2 companies, one a South African company, one an American company, completed the first underwater cable completely around Africa, providing that continent for the first time with the broadband capabilities that most of the world has taken for granted for much of the last 15 or 20 years. There are clearly lots of cell phones, computers, and internet subscribers around the continent. But again, an interesting factoid remains that the state of Illinois has more computers, more internet subscribers and users than all of sub-Saharan Africa. Closing this digital divide at the education and commercial level are absolutely essential in Africa if it is going to be able to compete globally with Asia, Europe, and the Americas. Africa must also reverse the professional brain drain. Thousands of Africa's most important professionals, especially doctors, nurses, pharmacists, and engineers, leave Africa every year for lucrative jobs in Europe, the United States, and Canada. It is hard to go into a hospital in Great Britain, the United States, Canada, or Australia without encountering a very able and competent African doctor or nurse. Hundreds of Africa's best students also leave for academic training in the West, but never return home. Africa cannot succeed unless it is able to attract and retain its best and its brightest. Innovative programs must be put in place to encourage, and I use the word encourage, not force, not demand, because that would be absolutely wrong, but simply to encourage Africa's most talented professionals to utilize some of their professional times and skill at home. Africa must also invest even more, and I stress even more, in girls' education. No country, no continent can succeed when it ignores half of its population. Although things are starting to change in most African countries, women and girls are still less likely to be enrolled in school, less likely to receive higher education, and less likely to be employed in the formal economy. Educating girls and women also delays early marriages, reduces early pregnancies, promotes better child care, and creates better informed citizens. As I said earlier, we are committed, and Secretary Clinton is committed to making women's issues a priority as she deals with Africa. Africa must also expand teacher training programs and improve the skills of its older teachers. The expansion of primary school education in a number of countries, while extraordinarily laudatory, has placed a great strain on the educational systems in those countries, forcing governments to put ill-equipped and poorly qualified teachers in many classrooms. Providing a student with a book, a desk, and a seat in a classroom is not enough when the teacher does not have the skills to teach the student what he or she needs to learn. If primary students do not receive sound education in their early years, they will not make much progress as they move ahead to secondary school and universities. Educated teachers are essential for producing good students. Finally, I think it is important that Africa invests greater funding in academic research and in its institutions of higher education. The number of African universities, public and private, has increased dramatically across the continent since the early 1960s. But the number of great African universities, like the University of Ibadan in Nigeria, have declined. Many of Africa's major universities are overcrowded, underfunded, and sometimes deeply neglected. Teachers work outside jobs to earn enough to live on, and research is frequently neglected in favor of other wage-earning opportunities. If Africa's institutions of higher education do not produce good graduates, the quality of teaching will decline in both secondary and primary school as well. When I started, I said that America's core objectives in Africa are to promote good governance and strong democratic institutions, to encourage sustained economic growth and development, to stop conflicts and political violence, to improve public health and sanitation, and to partner with African countries to address such issues as global warming and global health pandemics. I think these are also goals that most African nations share. Education and widespread literacy will play a key role in achieving all of these goals. And certainly we in the United States government are committed to help. There is absolutely no doubt that governance, economic development, conflict, climate change, and transnational threats will impact on Africa. But the only way Africa can have an impact on them is through education and universal literacy. I'm going to stop right there. I may have gone a little bit over my time, and I will certainly be willing to answer any questions that you may have as a part of the roundtable. It is not often that I talk about education, and I certainly will be happy to share with you thoughts about U.S. policy on any of the countries or regions that you are concerned with. And certainly if you have any issues that are beyond this, depending on our time, I certainly will be willing to answer your questions. Again, I want to thank Provost Tom Sullivan and also Dean Atwood for their gracious hospitality to allow me to come here this afternoon. Thank you for being a good audience.
Well, thank you very much for those thoughtful words. We've been calling you Mr. Ambassador today. You've been an ambassador 3 times. I want people here in the audience to know that his formal title is Mr. Secretary, because all the ambassadors, the U.S. ambassadors in Africa, work for him. So we've been downgrading him a little bit here today, although it's a very honorable title to have. We want to invite questions now from the audience. I hope you'll identify yourself and be brief so we can get many more questions in. I'm going to start the ball rolling, though. This man is a professional diplomat, and he has had to represent the United States government over the many years in Africa. He's had to explain good policies and some perhaps not so good over the years, and he does it as a tremendous professional. And I know that well. The first time we met was in Botswana when you were Chargé d'Affaires, actually. I'm going to ask you to step out of your comfort zone for a minute, and I want you to tell us how you feel now, after 40 years, representing the United States in Africa with an African-American president.
Actually, I'm in my comfort zone, and it's a wonderful opportunity at a historic moment in time. I think that the election of President Barack Obama is a manifestation of the democratic values that we all hold dear as Americans. I certainly feel that this is probably a moment more reflective of 1960 when President John F. Kennedy was sworn in as the President of the United States. A youthful, intelligent, thoughtful, visionary, forward-looking leader coming in to take the helm of the United States and prepared to boldly lead us further along to the kind of democratic values and norms that we all believe in and hope constantly to make more perfect than they are. I think that we are, as Americans, at probably one of our proudest moments in our history. Not very many countries around the world, even our strongest democratic partners and allies, have ever been able to do what we have done. And I think it is the openness of our democratic system, it is our values, our commitment to equality and justice that allows a president like President Obama to be elected. He probably is as conscious as I am as a black American that people of color represent only 13% of the American population. He needed a lot more votes than that to be where he is. And that says a lot about Americans as a whole. And I think we have something to be proud of and something that others will remain to aspire to.
So we'll go from one side to the other. I believe we have microphones. There's a man in the back. I ask you to identify yourself and be as brief as possible. Do we not have microphones or not? Okay, very good. Wait for the microphone. All right, thank you.
Hello. My name is John Flomo. I come from Liberia. Thank you today for being here. My question is, in Africa, it has been studied and found that about 50% of the funds donated to African countries for development come back to the United States with professionals who go there as consultants. What is the State Department policy on how to empower African scholars or African professionals to lead projects in their own country? Thank you.
That's a very good question. I'm not sure whether it's 50%. I'm not sure what percentage of the development assistance dollar actually flows back to consultants and flows back to the United States. I would say whatever it is, it's probably a little bit too much. President Obama himself has addressed this issue. And he has said that he would prefer to have a stronger USAID, a stronger U.S. agency for international development to carry out much of the development assistance work that is done overseas so that we can reduce the reliance on contractors who sometimes charge excessively for administrative overhead. I think that it is also important to do as what you said, and that is to empower and hire and use local consultants who know their countries and know the issues. We need to do more of this. I mentioned that one of the things that Africa must do is to not allow its best and brightest to leave. By hiring more of them at home as consultants with good pay would probably be one of the things that might help. But you've identified an issue and a problem. We have to watch overheads. We have to watch the use of consultants. Development assistance dollars should go for development assistance projects. Development assistance dollars should go for development assistance projects in developing countries.
I agree. Have someone on this side, please.
My name is Lul. I'm from Somalia. I agree with you 100%. The point that you mentioned is that women are behind in Africa because of their culture, because of literacy. Apart from that, I agree with you to encourage we as a diaspora group to go back and help our people. But what is the best approach in the State Department to help us, those of us who are willing to go back and help our people?
I think there are many ways, and if you are an American citizen, I would say that one of the ways that you can help your former country is to work for USAID, work for the State Department. You can work for an NGO, and there are numerous NGOs out there, World Vision, CARE, Catholic Relief Services, AfriCare. There are many out there that employ workers to work overseas. Sorry, if you're from a country which has voluntary organizations, you might look to them for opportunities. But one of the things that I think is extremely important is to take advantage of the opportunities that present themselves. And as I say, if you're a Somali American, I think there are probably a number of ways that you could probably be usefully engaged in trying to help.
Okay, over here.
Good afternoon. My name is Lucy Slater, and I'm from here. Many Africans and African countries were very excited at the election of President Obama and saw it as a change in possible relationships and emphasis between the U.S. government and Africa. Now that we're facing, the economic situations that we are and the other domestic issues that we are, do you think they will be disappointed?
I think that expectations in Africa with the election of President Obama were extraordinarily high, but they were also extraordinarily high here as well. I think that probably there will be some people who think that he will not be able to live up to their expectations, but I think that he is committed to doing as much as he possibly can. I do not believe that our current economic crisis will inhibit our ability to carry out the programs which have been running successfully in Africa, and I do not think that they will inhibit this administration from undertaking new signature initiatives that will have a significant impact on the continent. One that is already unfolding is the President's Food Security Initiative. The President and the Secretary of State are absolutely committed to helping to grow Africa's important agricultural sector. 60 to 70% of all African households depend primarily or secondarily on agriculture as a source of their income. But yet Africa unlike Asia and unlike India, which experienced green revolutions in the 1970s, has not had an agricultural green revolution. African farmers produce less per hectare than their Asian and Latin American counterparts. They use less fertilizer than their Asian and Latin American counterparts. Their seed stock is not as sophisticated as the seeds that are used by others, and their techniques are not as good. In the 1970s and 80s, largely through the scientific work of the late Nobel laureate, Professor Borlaug, Carnegie, and Ford, we helped create the green revolutions that have eliminated food shortages and hunger in places like India. It was our technology that went to Brazil that helped to transform that country's agricultural sector and make it a competitor to our own Midwestern agricultural sector. That green revolution has not arrived in Africa, and there is a tremendous effort underway by the U.S. government to say that the time has come for Africa to experience its green revolution. The president in Rome at the G8 meeting prior to the last G20 in Pittsburgh announced a commitment of $3.5 billion for agricultural assistance to Africa. The rest of the world pledged some $16 billion. Secretary Clinton this past Saturday, both at the Clinton initiative that her husband runs, as well as at the UN with Secretary General Ban Ki-moon, announced our agricultural initiatives there. This administration is committed to help create a green revolution in Africa. Just as the President said, it is time to help Africa deal with the issues of eliminating diseases like malaria and cholera from Africa. It is also time for us to help Africa be able to realize its enormous potential in agriculture. Last word on that is that we in the United States sometimes forget that we are enormously great. We think that we are great because of our enormous technology, our enormous education, our enormous innovation, our enormous scientific skills. But the thing that we sometimes forget is that we have had an enormously successful agricultural sector in this country almost from the very beginning. And our greatness is sometimes not measured in our agricultural strength and productivity, but it should be. Africa has that potential. It's important for us to help them realize it.
When these new initiatives are launched, please look to the University of Minnesota. Norman Borlaug was a graduate of the University of Minnesota. The person who received the Brazilian Presidential Award for helping the Brazilian agricultural economy was the former dean of the Humphrey Institute, Ed Hsu. So we've got a lot of talent here. Come back. One more question, because we have another group we're going to be meeting with in just a minute. Please.
Good afternoon, Mr. Secretary. My name is Lakeisha Ransom, and I'm from Minneapolis. My question is really an extension of the green revolution that you mentioned, and looking at some of the new and emerging green technologies that are, taking place around the world, whether it's wind or solar. What evidence, or how have you seen some of those new technologies take place in Africa, and what opportunity do you see for the continent in maybe taking a leadership role in that phase of the green revolution?
A good question, and I'm going to say that the administration has not yet rolled out a serious initiative on in climate change and environment. But I would say stay tuned to this channel. I think there is a commitment to help deal with this issue as well, and to help Africa deal with it. There are right now people talking about some fairly sophisticated things with respect to Africa. While we have not seen yet the widespread use of solar or wind or other green or renewable technologies in Africa, I can tell you that I certainly have had discussions with a number of people about the use of sophisticated instruments such as carbon credits. How do you how do you get some of the northern European states, like Sweden, like Finland, like Norway, like Germany, to use carbon credits to help fund the development and capitalization of solar and wind farms in Africa. They come up with the capital or part of the capital in Northern Europe to fund very sophisticated and large energy systems, renewable energy systems in Africa. And these renewable energy systems produce no greenhouse gases and are there because we have sunshine and wind. I think we're likely to see very sophisticated kinds of instruments come forward in the next several years on this kind of these kinds of ventures. I think there is also moving back from that in a more conventional way. I know that there are companies and individuals and groups that are looking at solar projects across Africa that will help African countries deal with some of their environmental challenges. The environmental challenges, of course, are the illegal logging and cutting of trees, which damage the environment and also reduce the level of moisture and rainfall. But if, in effect, you have use solar energy and you can provide that solar energy to people for cooking, for water, and for other purposes, that means that men and women don't have to go out and cut down as many trees for charcoal. It means that runoff doesn't destroy the land. It means that forests are not destroyed. And there is a lot of forests being destroyed in Africa, which needs to be saved. But there are things that are out there. People are talking about them. They're in the early stages. And there's some are very, very sophisticated, and hopefully we'll see some of them move forward in the next several years.
Well, let me thank you, Mr. Secretary, for a wonderful presentation, and thank Books for Africa, thank Provost Sullivan, thank everyone here, special VIP guests, including the Ambassador of the UN from Tanzania, and all of you. There's going to be a continuation of discussions about these issues, and there are many, many bright people in this audience that can share with the rest of the audience here. So we'll have those breakout sessions later. And all I can say, Mr. Ambassador, Mr. Secretary, is that our relations with Africa are in great hands. And thank you so much for your service.